Hi everyone, and welcome to video number 12 on USA conflict 1954 to 75. And this video, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be looking at the politics, what laws were actually introduced to deal with the civil rights issue from around about 1963 to 1965. Now this video follows on obviously from video 11. In the previous video, we were looking at 4 important events which began to drive change. Check back in video 11 if you wish to refresh your memory. But what we're looking at in this video is how those 4 events impacted what they led to change the laws in America. So that's this video. Before we can get to the actual laws, we have to study America itself, starting right at the very top with 2 of the American presidents, both quite famous men. The first one, president, won the election in 1960, and January 1961 to November 1963, we have President John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And following on from that, I'll talk about his successor, President Lyndon Baines Johnson. Let's start with Kennedy. When he won the election, it was only roughly 100,000 votes that he won by. That's quite a small majority. And one of the reasons that he won was he did get support from black urban voters, particularly in the North, where more blacks would vote. He was also quite interested in trying to help the whole situation of civil rights. But when he gets there, first of all, he makes a speech talking about America as the new frontier, new developments, changes on the way. But he had to strike a balance, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, he wanted to help black people in America, but he didn't want to upset the Southern States Democrats, who were allegedly members of his party. He was a Democrat president. Now, they were called the Dixiecrats. Have a look back at video number 7, where I talked about the Dixiecrats. So Kennedy wants to help the blacks, but doesn't want to upset the Dixiecrats. He's got a balancing act to do there. But he does do quite a few positive things to help blacks in America. First of all, he appointed black people into quite senior roles. A man called Thurgood Marshall, famous for the Brown versus Topeka education case. Kennedy makes him a federal judge, a black man, a federal judge, and he appoints 4 other blacks to be judges. So he's beginning to sort of try and introduce them into the top jobs in America. Then, if you remember the James Meredith case, when he was trying to learn and graduate from Mississippi University, 1 man, 1 student, Kennedy sent 23,000 federal troops to protect him and help him. Now that's quite a big undertaking, 23,000 to help 1 black man at the University of Mississippi. He also sent US Marshals to protect the Freedom Riders. One thing that you might not know, those of you who follow American football, if you look at American football today, there's obviously white and black people on the team. Back then, though, the Washington Redskins, very famous team, they did not have any black players. They were segregated. It was an all-white team. And Kennedy challenged this, and he said, no, that's not right. And he threatened, because the federal government had funded the Washington Redskins stadium, he threatened to kick them out of the stadium. And it was in 1962, when Kennedy was president, that finally the Washington Redskins accepted black people into their team and desegregated. Linking to the previous video, very important. If you remember all the work that the civil rights activists did down in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, this had a huge impact on Kennedy. It encouraged him to start drafting up the Civil Rights Bill. He wanted to pass a law to help black people get more equality. And then the march to Washington, August 63, again Kennedy and Martin Luther King are involved. They are talking to each other. But then, of course, November 1963, when he was electioneering to try and win the next election in 1964, Kennedy was shot down in Dallas, Texas, Dealey Plaza, Elm Street. Well, it was a nightmare on Elm Street for America, or certain parts of America. What would happen once Kennedy had been assassinated? His replacement? President, well, he was the vice president, he stepped up, Lyndon Baines Johnson. What would Johnson do? Well, he continued. He carried on the work of Kennedy. Kennedy had spoken about America as a new frontier. Johnson spoke about America as a great society. He wanted to carry on a lot of the ideas of Kennedy. He carried on appointing black people to top jobs. Patricia Harris became the US ambassador to Luxembourg. Remember Thurgood Marshall, the black man that Kennedy had made a judge? Johnson takes it a stage further and makes him a judge on the Supreme Court. Johnson also followed the path that Kennedy was directing towards. He supported the Civil Rights Act, which we'll discuss later in this video, and he supported the Voting Rights Act, which again we'll discuss in this video. Johnson was from the South, down in Texas. So he knew some of the Dixiecrats. He knew them because he was from that part of the world. That helped him in a way to gain a little bit of leverage over these Dixiecrats. Maybe he could persuade them to follow him. And another thing that he did, he protected the marchers, civil rights marchers who marched from two places, Selma to Montgomery. I'll talk about that later in this video. So Johnson is carrying on what Kennedy had started. Two presidents, both trying to support the civil rights movement, the civil rights struggle. So I've mentioned two laws there. Let's have a look at them in more detail. July 1964, the Civil Rights Act. Now the main points. Schools. The government had the power to force schools to desegregate, following on from Brown versus Topeka, following on from Little Rock. The federal government is controlling schools and the policy. That's the first thing. Second, votes. In the Act of 1964, the Civil Rights Act, the government is banning discrimination in the voter tests. Check back to video 2. In the area of jobs and employment, the government is banning discrimination in jobs, and they set up something called the Equal Opportunities Commission. The government also bans discrimination in public places, trying to challenge the old established Jim Crow laws. Also, in this act, the government would threaten to stop federal government funding. They would not provide the money unless the states were showing, or the organisations were showing, desegregation and equality. Some people have suggested this was Johnson's biggest achievement, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But there were some drawbacks, there were some failures. Number one, discrimination had not been abolished. The southern states could still ignore the federal law. They had ways to try and get round it. It was very difficult for the government to enforce the law down in the southern states. There was also still voting restrictions for black people. The states got round the new laws. For example, schools. You've got to include black people in your schools. Okay, we'll include one. Could you say that they're discriminating? Yes. But they've included a black person, so they've got round the law. Or they would have one black class kept separate to the whites in all the other classes. Can you see how they might get round it? Also, this Equal Opportunities Commission, you say that's good. That's really going to help equality. Good. But it could only investigate complaints. Well, what if you were a black person and you were too scared to complain? It would never get to the Equal Opportunities Commission. Also, they only had quite a small number of staff. So there was a huge backlog of cases. So you could argue really that there was not a huge amount of change. There was some change, but other change was still needed. Kennedy and Johnson trying to bring about change. Kennedy, shot in 1963. Reminds me of a song by Billy Joel, 1989, We Didn't Start the Fire. Have a listen to it because it shows the history of America from about the end of the Second World War right up until the end of the 80s. And in it he says, JFK, blown away, what else do I have to say? It was a huge event, but fortunately Johnson seems to have carried on Kennedy's direction. So the first law, the Civil Rights Act, yes, good, some progress, but still more to be done, as usual in history. Now, Martin Luther King and other civil rights groups, CORE, SNCC, SCLC, etc., they realised that voting was still a huge issue. So they picked a town called Selma down in Alabama. Here it is, ladies and gentlemen, number 9, just there. And it's very close to Montgomery down in Alabama. Selma and Montgomery, about 50 miles, about 80 kilometres. And Martin Luther King and the civil rights group say, right, we need to push on, we need to get more change. Why did they choose Selma? Well, Selma had the largest white citizens' council in Alabama. There was a fear because in Selma, 15,000 black people, but only 383 were registered to vote. King and his followers decided to try to change this. As usual, speeches, rallies, but they were beaten. They were arrested. There was violence again. Do you remember a man called Bull Connor and how violent he was? Well, the sheriff in Selma was a man who was very similar, a man called Jim Clark. Very similar. He used violence to try to get his way, or rather to stop the black civil rights activists from getting their way. So King comes up with an idea. He says, right, we will have a march. Remember they marched to Washington in August 63 and that was a big success. So King is repeating his tactics here. Let's march from Selma to Montgomery. And when we get to Montgomery, hand in a petition to the state governor, Governor Wallace of Alabama, demanding, asking for voters' rights for black people. That was the plan. Sunday, the 7th of March, 600 protesters, 600 activists set off. They stopped at a place called Edmund Pettus Bridge, and Alabama state troopers, basically the police force, the local police force, attacked the protesters with tear gas, clubs, electric cattle prods, and the protesters were forced to withdraw and scrap the march. Jim Clark using the violent tactics of Bull Connor. Publicity, publicity. Of course, it's all caught on camera. The newspapers, the media are there. The black people, the civil rights activists using non-violence. The state troopers attacking them. It looked very bad for the state troopers. It helped the cause of the civil rights activists yet again. President Johnson saw it. He was very impressed with the bravery, the courage, the commitment, the determination of the civil rights activists. He meets Martin Luther King. He says, right, we cannot have this. I'm going to step in. I'm going to use federal government power. And he ordered the Alabama state troops under federal control so that they could not disobey him. Finally, the march occurred. 54 miles from Selma to Montgomery, March the 21st to March the 24th. The march was peaceful. Now, the Selma March, ladies and gentlemen, recently made into a film. Very, very important and significant because it plays on Johnson's mind and it makes Johnson think, right, I have got to act. I've got to support these people. and we get the 1965, August 1965, the Voting Rights Act. Johnson had been heavily influenced. So you could say Selma was a bit of a turning point here. What did the Voting Rights Act actually say? Well, let's have a look at it. There was to be a standard voting registration process, controlled by the federal government, not individual states. The literacy tests, those questions that I've shown you before, they were to be abolished. A step forward. States could introduce their own new voting registration and regulations, but only if the federal government agreed. The federal government is trying to take control of the whole process. Federal government officials would take over by law all voter registration if in that particular state there was lower than 50% of the people qualified to vote actually registered. Can you see what they're doing? They're trying to take the power away from the southern states into their hands so that it would be fairer and they would get more black people registered to vote. So again, this was a change. It was a step forward, undoubtedly. By the end of 1965, so within a few months, the federal government had registered 80,000 new black voters. By the end of 1968, 3 years later, that figure was 750,000. So you can say, yes, the Voting Rights Act was beginning to have an impact. Let's step back a bit. What had Martin Luther King and the civil rights groups like NAACP, CORE, SNCC, SCLC, etc., what had they achieved? Well, since they first started their non-violent and peaceful campaigns, they'd actually achieved quite a bit. Many Supreme Court decisions had gone their way. 2 new laws had actually been passed which supported them. 2 new presidents, President Kennedy and President Johnson, are giving them their support. They're getting really good publicity opposed to the bad publicity for people in the southern states. They're raising their support amongst the rest of America. Civil rights has become the top issue, the most urgent issue in American domestic policies. So you can say, yes, some of it had worked. But there was still a long way to go. Progress was still slow. By the end of 1968, 65% of black people in America were registered to vote. In the state of North Carolina, it was still only 54%. So there was still work to do. They still faced huge levels of discrimination in their normal life. Things that are vital to lead a successful and happy life. Housing, work, education, medical care, treatment by the police. Black people were still discriminated against on a massive scale. Some people begin to think, had Martin Luther King and the civil rights groups, have they been too willing to do deals with white authority? Have they been too trusting? Have they been too naive? There was a song at the time, "We shall overcome, we shall overcome, we shall overcome someday." But was that day too far in the future? Yes, they were on the road, but they weren't there yet. Ladies and gentlemen, we see the emergence of a different group, different people, with different ideas, different strategies, different tactics. They were more impatient for change. They were more radical. They looked at King and said, yeah, you've done a bit, but it's nowhere near enough. We are going to change things much more quickly. Now, who were they? And what did they want? You've guessed it. It's coming next video. As ever, I hope this has been useful. All the best now. See you soon.